Welcome to Innovation Night. The world around us is upended and changing at an amazing speed. It's affecting how we live, how we communicate, how we do business, and it's affecting security and geopolitics. It is truly changing things quickly. Word is that transformation is not only going to continue, it is going to accelerate. The competition is intense and the stakes could not be more high. Over the next few hours, we're going to explore several aspects of innovation, including how can we capitalize on all of this emerging technology? What are the challenges of staying on the cutting edge of change? How do we surmount some of these challenges? And perhaps we'll get a glimpse at what's coming down the road. I'm Jean Meserve. I'm a journalist. I am a member of the Homeland Security Experts Committee and co-host of the Spy Talk podcast. I'll be guiding you through tonight's events. We're going to be looking at three key areas of innovation: cybersecurity, space, and also military. And to get things underway, let me introduce Christian Bruch, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of Siemens Energy. He is also co-chair of the MSC Security Innovation Board. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean, and a pleasure really to be here today for hopefully what is an insightful and exciting discussion. I have the pleasure, together with Ambassador Ischinger, to chair the Munich Security Innovation Board. And what is this about? It's about really bringing a very diverse group of people together, and really which cut across different regions and also different institutions, companies, political bodies, and all the likes. And it was driven by the view that today's problems are complex, interlinked, urgent, and always linked to security. Cybersecurity, health issues, pandemics, climate change, energy supply, resource constraint. We've learned more than ever in the last years that this is always a threat to global security and are challenges which can only be solved by innovation. But how to get to innovations? I think this is something which we always, particularly I as an engineer, like to link to the subject of technology. Very quickly I jumped to the conclusion that I need more technology. Well, we see obviously in the diverse discussions always that it's not always technology. Technology actually in a lot of areas is available. It is also the question is, how do we apply it to certain problems? How do we change perspective on a problem, on what we looked? And this is where diversity comes in, and learning and listening to others. And this is why I extremely appreciate to be part of today's discussion and venue here, to hear from others on how you tackle problems, because changing the perspective is really the key driver for innovation, and the transferability of approaches is always what amazes me. I come obviously from the energy world. I look a lot around energy technologies, and sometimes I recognize defense has a lot of parallel problems. Cyber has a lot of parallel problems that we're trying to solve. So let's make sure that we intensify cooperation, in particular on a conference like here. Let's get also defense and business closer together, because we will need really this to drive and get to new innovations. Big problems are global. Innovation cannot be only local, and this is really what fosters innovation and partnerships, and also to speed up scalability of technologies. And it also brings to the point, if you talk about innovation, at the end it's also about deployment of innovation. So how do we actually achieve that innovation is applied and deployed? If it comes to energy, it's particularly interesting because all the change in energy obviously also drives the global tectonics, which is now completely different, and we have to see on how we get innovation on the ground. So how do we come from innovation to implementation? Creating an environment for change. If I look back on the discussion, we just concluded the Innovation Board at the Munich Security Conference today, we all see the same problem. The willingness in our particular democratic societies to drive change is low. And that is something which makes it much more difficult in democracies really to have the right speed of change. We see that autocracies are much easier sometimes moving forward on innovations. So how do we tackle it? How do we create an environment really of willingness to change? And how do we create a narrative which people understand that change is good and an opportunity which we need to embrace? Innovation without implementation is irrelevant. We always have to see that. But for complex problems are no easy answers. So developing a narrative that people understand it and can create an appetite for innovation, because it affects them as an individual, is extremely important for a group like this, for a group who is deeply immersed in innovation and understands it, but we have to make sure that it arrives at the society. In this regard, many thanks really for joining today's discussion. Thanks to the Munich Security Conference to start a cross-discipline dialogue, and I'm curious to everything what we were listening today. Thank you, Jean.
Mr. Brook, thank you so much for your remarks. Some of the most exciting innovation that we're seeing is taking place in space. We're seeing new exploration, new discoveries, and that means new challenges and new opportunities. We're going to talk about those now, and to set the stage for us is Dirk Zimper. He is Executive Board Representative of Defense and Security Research at the German Aerospace Center. Over to you.
Thank you, Jean. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite you to a journey now. Obviously not a physical one, but in your mind. So this is a call to your imagination, and I would really much appreciate you following me. So let's get started. Imagine that you wake up in the morning, and after the usual morning routine, you go to grab a coffee, you have a look on your mobile phone to check the weather app, and you see, okay, it's going to be warm outside, and you dress in an appropriate way. On your way to the car, you start to freeze because it's bitterly cold outside. And you think to yourself, thank you, weather app. Okay. So then you go around the corner to the ATM to withdraw some cash, but the ATM is out of order. So then you go to your car. Sitting in the car, you switch on Google Maps to enter the destination you would like to go to. And after trying to start the navigation system again, and again, and again, and again, you realize the navigation system is not working. So then you think, okay, what can I do? Because usually you use the navigation system even if you go to the bakery around the corner. And then you recall, oh, wait a moment, I will go to the next petrol station. Because in the past, you bought their physical maps. So you drive to the petrol station. At the petrol station, you see an endless queue of people because they seem to have the same issue as you have. They would like to buy physical maps because their navigation system is not working. But you do not queue because you realize a notice saying that the card payment system is out of order and you do not have cash. You switch on the radio and then you hear breaking news on all channels. The stock market is collapsing. Ground transportation is not working at all. All aircraft grounded due to missing navigation signals. And big nations accuse each other for hostile attitude and even go into a direction to military consequences. And now you think to yourself, oh my goodness, what is going on? And I can tell you what's going on. Space is going on. Or let's put it that way, space is not working at all. Because what I just described is how a day would look like without our space-based assets. And I'm talking about all the services that we use on a day-to-day basis. Most of us do not even recognize how much we depend on our space-based services. It's almost a given that within the first hour of your normal day, you use a space-based service. So in short, space is essential for our daily life. And I would go that far and say that space is a critical infrastructure, especially when we talk about security and defense applications and our global security. So, as somebody coming from a research organization, I can tell you that working space technologies is hard. And now, I would like to give you a snapshot, an insight to the front line of space operations. And before doing that, I would like to hand over to our chair of the executive board, Professor Dr. Anke Rita Kaiser-Pützhaller.
Dr. Zimper, ladies and gentlemen, hello from the German Aerospace Center to the Munich Security. Dr. Zimper, ladies and gentlemen, hello from the German Aerospace Center to the Munich Security Conference Innovation Night. We, as the German Aerospace Center, do research on aeronautics, space, energy, transport, as well as across topics of digitalization and security and defense. Innovation thus really is at our heart. Innovation is something we strive for, and therefore I'm very honored to be here, albeit digitally, at the MSC Innovation Night. And I'm sure the MSC Innovation Night is going to be a true driver for innovation and at the same time to one of the most intriguing topics for mankind, space and security. The genuinely interdisciplinary setup of us as a German Aerospace Center allows us to take up the challenge of numerous pressing topics, especially in the area of security and defense-related technologies. Indeed, space in particular plays an essential role in this context. We all heavily depend on our critical infrastructure, space. This raises several questions. How do we operate this infrastructure? How do we ensure safe and secure operations? How can we protect it and make it more resilient to threats and at the same time inject innovations? We will give you now an insight how DLR is addressing these very urgent issues. Let us have together a direct look into the heart of German space operations. Therefore, I hand over to Professor Felix Huber, our director of the German Space Operations Center.
Thank you, Professor Kaiser-Pizzalla. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the heart of German satellite operations. We are here located at the German Space Operations Center, 30 minutes southwest of Munich in Oberpfaffenhofen. The GSOC has 50 years of experience in operation of satellites. And I can tell you, operating a complex satellite is rocket science. As the director of German Space Operations Center, I am not only responsible for the operation of satellites, but also for the development of a profound and state-of-the-art ground segment. Let me give you an example. In the background, you see the TerraSat Tandem mission, a satellite mission that was established to give you a so-called digital elevation model of the Earth's surface. Operating these satellites is not simple, as they have to fly in a closed formation called a helix. Without this combination of governmental, industrial and scientific work, it would not be able to conduct such a mission. These satellites operate in closed formations, which means we have to keep them in a certain position at any time with a good flight dynamics. All this is only possible as we have a good satellite, a profound ground segment and state-of-the-art onboard software that was continually upgraded, otherwise such a mission would not have been possible. These satellites are handled so nicely that the envisioned lifetime of 5 years is now more than 15 years already and still going on. Such a development of the ground segment would not be possible if it would not fulfill security and safety requirements, but also the scientific requirements. That means the German Space Operations Center is set up to handle both scientific, governmental and commercial services in one place. And now let me hand over back to Dirk Zimper at the Munich conference.
Thank you, Professor Huber. So let's go to a short summary. Security, defense, space, and innovation are closely interconnected. We have seen that with the example of space operations. As you heard, that we are doing continuous innovation to address or to inject new functionalities into our space-based services, into space operation. On the one hand, we heavily depend on our space-based assets, which imposes risk. On the other hand, space gives great opportunities, and we see rising technologies in the quantum sector which allow new capabilities when it comes to communication, when it comes to navigation. So we have risk and opportunity, and a solution for that dilemma is actually given by innovation. For example, responsive space capabilities to increase the resilience and reduce risk at the same time. Let's say it simply. Innovation is key for success because success is driven by innovation. And now I would like to finish up with a quote from Brené Brown. And this may surprise some of you, but there's a very important element inside. And the quote is, "There is no innovation and creativity without failure." Period. And I would say, let's fail quick to innovate at the speed of relevance. Thank you. I hand back to Jean.
Thank you, Dirk Zimper. We heard at our last Innovation Night that we have to embrace failure if we're truly going to have innovation. I'm sure we'll hear more about that. We certainly are going to hear more about space in the next several days. But right now, we're going to transition to cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a battlefield. It is dynamic. It is multi-layered. And it's crucial. Innovation in this sector is an absolute must. We've assembled a great panel here to talk about it today. Why don't I start from this end, introducing people. Andreas Kind is Vice President of Cybersecurity and Trust at Siemens. Thanks so much for joining us. Also with us is Kirsty Kaljulaid. Am I saying it correctly? Close enough?
Kaljulaid.
Okay, thank you. She is the former president of Estonia, which knows a thing or two about cyber, to say the least. And also Andreas Weigand is with us. He's director of the Social Data Lab and former chief scientist at Amazon. Great to have you all with us here today.
Thank you.
President Kaljulaid, let me start with you if I could. As I understand it, you've just come back from Ukraine. And I wonder if you could tell us what you're seeing there in terms of the cyber battlefield. Are you seeing the Russians deploy new technologies, new tactics, new techniques? What's going on?
Well, not really new technologies and new techniques. Good old DDoS is still good and cheap and works quite a lot of times, and we know that because these pass, this is very often a question of a cyber hygiene. Of course, if you are attacking, let's say, sophisticated technology and systems, then you have to use also more expensive technologies. But frankly, I'm astonished to ask this specifically about Ukraine, because tech and frontline is everywhere. Because it's not about Ukraine, it's about democracies against autocracies. It's about our democracies and ultimatums from Russia. We all have to understand that we are all at risk. So what better to confuse the situation in the free world than to use not even cyber conventional attacks, but hybrid attacks trying to, influence our minds, which is far more common and far more efficient and effective than just taking somebody's, power grid or power plant down, which of course doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to these kind of attacks. We should. And we should all recognize frontline is all of us here in Germany, down south in Portugal and Italy, us in the Baltics, and of course also in Ukraine. But no, you didn't see anything out of the order. Frankly speaking, they're far more calmer than we are about the situation.
But what it did perhaps show is that we still don't have good defense when it comes to these sorts of attacks.
Well, even in 2007, when Estonia came under a cyber attack, and I guess it was the first ever cyber attack against an independent nation trying to affect its sovereignty, nobody else could be probably attacked but Estonia. But even then, it was relatively easy to protect the works inside the country and basically kind of close us off from the global internet, and we were even then able to handle it. So of course there are solutions, and of course I'm sure Ukrainians are able to protect their e-government, which is Trambita, for example. So this can be done, and of course it's not about technology, it's about society. Because the problems start with cyber hygiene. We all know this, that problems start with cyber hygiene. If people in the hospitals do not use predictable passwords, not Petjas don't pass. It's so simple. Yet they keep passing. But of course, in the frontline countries, as you call us there, we are maybe a little bit more aware. And actually, I think we are less at risk than you are.
I'm curious about the disinformation problem, which I hear so much about in all of the work that I do. And I'm curious, either of the Andreases who are here, what's the effective counter to that? We have seen deplatforming. We have seen attempts to screen content and label content. I don't want to dwell too long on this, but I think since it's been introduced, I'd love to hear from either of you what you think the solution might be, apart from personal responsibility and education, as mentioned by the President.
Do you want to start? Oh, you get first. Oh, go ahead, please.
I'll make the call. Go ahead.
So I think an interesting perspective is that of deep fakes. So I rather like to have specific examples than just talk in general about misinformation or disinformation. So deep fakes means that there's a picture which just looks like me and which sounds like me, but it wasn't me. So where now do we go with that? How do we know what actually is the case? Like you here on the other side of this video, what makes you believe that we actually are in Munich? So I think it's very, very tricky to know how do we trust information.
So on the issue of deep fakes specifically, I actually, at another conference, interviewed supposedly Donald Trump on a screen. It was a deep fake. And to be perfectly frank, it wasn't that good. That was a couple of years ago. Has the technology changed a lot? Are deep fakes now much more credible than they were even 2 years ago?
When I teach, I typically like people to look back 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years. And having the grounded in those time scales then gives us the possibility to say, well, what will happen 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? Because in the abstract, when we look back 1 year, nothing really changed, did it? But then, on the other hand, if it's 5 years, things change big time. So I think the question is, what granularity are you at?
And do we have the technology to detect deep fakes, to figure out when we see something on a screen, is that the real thing or is it a fake?
I think we are less and less able to do that, to know the difference.
I see some head shaking going on here.
On the screen, to be clear, in person, I think that's a different story. But on the screen, I wouldn't trust it.
Yeah, I mean, your turn, but I'll come after you. I think you can resolve it. I mean, you are the tech guy here, I'm not. But frankly speaking, our problems of the Web 2 and deepfakes, I mean, their solutions are all in Web 3. I mean, we're all very afraid of Web 3 and cryptocurrencies and everybody issuing their own money and the leakages to the fiscal system, which is indeed a problem. But I think about the technology, which is underlying it, actually allows us to make sure that the sequence of the things is truly happening. There are timestamps, there are the ability to control and verify, and I think sooner or later nobody will believe a picture where there is, I mean, basically not some kind of a token which supports the validity of this picture or this video. So the solutions are there technologically. We should not be afraid to, well, use them, understand them, and implement them.
So are they being implemented? That's the question. We heard from Mr. Brook at the very beginning that, you know, innovation is pointless if it's not implemented. Are people using those technologies akin to blockchain to figure out the veracity of images yet?
Well, let me maybe jump in if it's okay.
Absolutely,
I wanted
please.
to sort of reply to your Donald Trump challenge. I think it's much easier with voice, and there have been real attacks where people like pretended to have the voice of a CEO and then made something happen on the other side. So it is happening. So technology has advanced also over the years, and it's actually the race of artificial intelligence and machine learning that makes it possible. And it's a race between the offensive side and the defensive side. And we see it in many areas, in normal cybersecurity as well, where we always have this kind of race, who's faster. And with artificial intelligence, it became very clear that you can use it to do attacks in an easier way, to find out where are the vulnerabilities, to maybe trick also the machine learning approaches where you deliberately change a picture. As a human, you think it's still the original picture, but it actually will be recognized as something completely different. And then you have machine learning, artificial intelligence also on the defensive side, where these technologies enable to protect in a better way. But you have to be always one step ahead, of course. Otherwise, again, the other side will win. And so that would be my reply to the first part. Maybe to the Web 3, I think, yes, we have another challenges there, I agree. But still, we live in the Web 2 most of the time. So we have the platform economies, and most of the threats come through data leakages and platforms being attacked. If things become more decentralized, I don't think it will get better. So some people say, oh, blockchain makes it more secure. Probably not. And also the tokenization, yes, there's some crypto magic in place to, for instance, tag some real assets to the digital world that you can say, okay, now I have a link and I can do something on the digital side that has an impact on the real side, ownership, custody, whatever it is. Does it make things more secure? Probably not. So in that point, I agree. It's there, you have another plethora of vulnerabilities coming.
Mr. Weigand.
Yeah, I did my PhD many years ago on neural networks for prediction. And if I look back, what really has changed in the last 30 years, it is not the algorithms. And some would even argue that neural networks were just an application of some old chain rule of differentiation. What has changed is the data we have. So compute power, Moore's law, comes sort of growing fast, algorithms constant, but I think what really is new is the data that we create with every step we take, everything we do. When we walk in the street here, the amount of surveillance cameras in Germany is staggering. So we create data all the time. That's, I think, where the innovation comes from.
So let's talk for a moment about data. Obviously, a huge topic worldwide. Europe has tried to tackle it, and I'm wondering if you think, as someone who's studied this, that regulation is the way to deal with this conflict between data collection, so important to AI, and privacy, very important to individuals.
Good question. I was an advisor to Angela Merkel in the German Digital Council. And that's a question, of course, which very much a country like Germany is thinking about. What should we do about regulation? And I think it's very, very important that not only do we think about regulation, but also what do we do when people violate the laws? What do we do with them? When somebody leaks data to somewhere, what should we do there? I think that's as important as thinking about regulating it.
Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, just to add maybe on the privacy side, for sure, privacy is a really important topic, and we mostly think in this context about real people. You know, it's my data. I don't want to share necessarily. I want to be in control. I want to have maintained the sovereignty of what to do with it. But coming from an industrial perspective, I also see very similar need for protecting data. Actually, we talk about confidentiality in this case more. For instance, in supply chains, where we have the need for transparency, very similar to the personal side as well, where it's about the protection of your personal data. But also the transparency. So it's always the protection of the data, but also you need transparency. And it's very difficult to bring these two things together. And here is where I see really innovation in big need. So I think we should make sure that we can calculate things throughout the supply chain to make sure that we know where a product comes from, how it was produced, what kind of product carbon footprint it has, and so on, without necessarily revealing the confidentiality that, of course, exists in the supply chain in terms of the bill of materials, in terms of the logistics that nobody wants to share. And that's it where I see actually the privacy topic being even broader. It's not just related to us, but also to things and companies.
Well, since I am the politician between academia and business here, then I would really like to relate to this question about legal protection in the cyberspace. You have digital IDs. We in Estonia have digital IDs. We extensively use them. You not yet, but we all in Europe have a right to a digital ID. And with this comes also the legal system in every country. How the data which you share with somebody within this digital ID encrypted protected system is treated by the government, by the other parties. And this responsibility to create this legal space lies with the governments. Only governments can also issue, of course, digital IDs because they are simply our passports to act and transact online. And this relates to the very basic web which we are talking about right now. A problem, of course, is that if quantum computing really one day, happens, all our digital IDs, which we currently use, need to be, radically revamped. And I can tell you that our scientists and our, state authorities are already thinking, what do we do then? So if you go to protect your people online, accept governmental responsibility, which you have to, you are in it together with tech developers. Second element. Globally, we have really been bad at protecting through international law our cyberspace. I think it was only in February, March even, 2020 in United Nations Security Council, when the first time ever a cyber attack was discussed. We promised this to our electorate when Estonia was elected to Security Council, and we were a little bit opportunistic. There was a cyber attack against Georgia by Russia. First time ever it was discussed, attributed. And of course, you already had a file open, let's say, in the Security Council. So we were able to follow up with an informal, then formal meeting. So now it's becoming gradually part of the case law that cyber attacks can be discussed also at this level. But it's very important that we create a system where we also discuss cyber attacks which are not actually part of the conventional conflict. Why? Because they may be harbingers of a conventional conflict coming our way, be it cyber conventional or hybrid attacks against societies. They show us that something is really going wrong. And if we are able to create a body or a system or a framework where countries can go and report these issues, and we have an international law which will tell what happens to those who organize these attacks and what are the rights of countries to defend and protect themselves. Let's imagine, somebody attacks my country. I see where it's coming from. The other country accepts no responsibility. It may be because it is hostile, but it may be because it's coming from a digitally failed country which is not able to. So how do I react? Many nations already have declared their intent in cybersphere based on the academic work, for example, also in the NATO Cybersecurity Center of Excellence in Tallinn, basing their position on this academic work in Tallinn manuals. So this is important that we continue creating also international law to really be able and ready to fight back on the cyber attacks.
I want to follow up for just a moment on regulation, which was raised. From a commercial point of view, does regulation stifle innovation?
It's difficult to answer in general. There are cases where regulation comes in too early and you still want to continue innovation. You need to have freedom to let other ideas just grow and foster. But then at some point, at the right point, it's good to have regulation because then you let an industry converge to a standard and everybody can build on top of the standard. So that would be probably the generic answer. And there are many examples where things were done too early and maybe sometimes also done in the right way or too late.
I'd like to ask both of you, the Andreases, as I'll call you both, about quantum computing, which has been raised here, and whether the advent of that is going to really make the encryption that we're currently using to protect so much of our data ineffective. And is that a game changer, as was implied? And what are we going to do about it? Are we doing the research to get ahead?
Yeah, I think quick answer is yes. There are large communities in the world looking at this standardization bodies, and this is one example, to come up with a challenge to find out the quantum safe crypto schemes that we need for the future. Everybody knows that the classical today's cryptos, or some of today's crypto schemes, will not be secure anymore when we enter the era of quantum computers. In particular, the asymmetric schemes, public key infrastructures, the signing, the ID systems that we have in some countries in place, they would be in danger. And it's important for two reasons to act today. And many companies and institutions act on this. The first one is there are today already actors that collect data. They simply collect it in big data stores. for the time when they can decrypt it using quantum computers. So we have to act on this fairly fast. And secondly, some of the products have a very long lifetime, particularly industrial products. Think about a train, for instance. They are in the field for sometimes 30 years. So you want to deploy it maybe with a quantum secure scheme already today. If it doesn't exist, if there's not yet clear which scheme is the best one, at least you want to have the agility, the crypto agility, to be able to change it at a later point in time once it's clear which is the quantum safe crypto scheme.
Chris?
I think in many cases, technology leads and regulation follows. And I would like to give you an example. Clearview AI, which is a platform, software. I upload a picture, for instance, a picture about myself, which nobody has ever seen, just taken as a selfie. And within a second, in that case, I get 137 images back. All of them public images of me on the web. So think what that can do, for example, to law enforcement. That you can take a picture and upload it, and you will know not necessarily the name of the person, but dozens, hundreds of pictures of the same person. This here is an example of where we are way lagging behind where the reality is. Clearview AI exists. They got a few billion pictures which they trained their models on. The models are not that complicated. But here is an example what you can buy on the street, if you will, and regulation doesn't know what to do about it.
I wanted to follow up, by the way. Who's collecting all that data to use in the future if quantum computing comes to fruition?
Oh, it's the bad actors they're collecting, and maybe some...
You want to name names?
No.
Thought I'd try.
Well, I just wanted to say that regulation indeed has to be permissive of the new technologies to develop. And we in Estonia dreamed up a system so that we will not fall out of the tech cycle, is that the government calls, startup ideas to come into Accelerator Estonia, where the government then invests itself, which is not because they need money. There is so much startup money in Estonia because we have so many unicorns, but because then government has its skin in the game, which means that it has to adjust the legal space. Actually, Estonian digital state is a tightly regulated legal space, but it has to adjust and bring new flexibilities for new upcoming technology layers. And even this way, we clearly see that tech cycle is far shorter than legal cycle. And this is what we have as a problem in a common world where we are. Which means, of course, we need to learn how to, first of all, regulate for objective, not the pathway. We did it in the analog world previously. We said to the doctors, for example, keep the file safe. End of story. Now, with tech, we try to regulate the pathways, how to keep the file safe. In the red room, with the green door, this kind of regulation. We shouldn't. We should always regulate for objectives only and do it generation-neutral way. Ideally, regulating AI would work also in the singular AI world. So this is what we should have as an objective. Not trying to regulate and re-regulate and again when you have new innovations coming up. Think far ahead, regulate once, cross-sectoral, cross-technology generations.
I think one good question is, what is the bottleneck for innovation? The Bundeswehr has their Cyber Innovation Hub, where people come together and I think very effectively share things and come up with new ideas. But I think in general the question is, where do we think that the bottleneck is for innovation?
Where is it?
Well, for me as a person who's lived in San Francisco for the last 30 years, at the end of the day, it's all people driven. So bottleneck is good people.
You mean talent?
Talent, yes.
Talent. Okay, a problem?
Talent.
Yeah, it is a problem, yeah. Particularly in cybersecurity, we in all regions where we have research teams in cybersecurity, we have a problem to access good talent. So
I bet there are Estonians you probably could hire, right? You have a pretty good cyber workforce, don't you?
Yes, because I think we have realized that the meaning of talent in tech also has radically shifted and changed. It's not the geeks who are good with computers. It's far more broad spectrum of knowledge which we nowadays need, I mean, as talent in tech. And we do see this in our really vivid startup scene that, I mean, all social sciences are pretty useful. All kind of artsy things and stuff, these are also quite useful. So every basically subject you studied in university is nowadays useful in tech, and this is very encouraging, frankly.
That's an interesting point. Is the lens too narrow at a company like yours? Are you looking for the people who are music majors or psychology majors?
Yeah, I mean, we have areas where technology is applied and makes changes the way we do business. So that there are examples in the art industry, for instance, where you can take a piece of art and link it to technology and make sure it is sort of traded securely on sort of in a way that you couldn't do it before. So there are cases where you want to bring this new ideas back into the core technology area.
So this has been recognized as a bottleneck for a long time. Have you figured out potential solutions to this? Obviously, none have been implemented, but what do you think is the way to go?
I think the US university system has relatively, few very, very good universities where people find each other and learn from each other. So I think the talent pool or the stamp of approval is if you went to one of the top schools. What do we do for trying to create talent? And how much of it is not only how good programmer they are, but how good do they collaborate with people? Because, I mean, what is it? 90% of all programmers' time is spent writing emails. So ultimately, what are the bottlenecks? What can we teach? How can we teach it?
I would really like to praise industry taking things in their own hands and thinking here about schools like Paris 42 in Paris and Lyon, for example, which is kind of a school system which helps people with tech skills, coding skills, moving from one level to another. It's not formally recognized as part of the French education system, but every company knows that, I mean, if people are level 6, 7, they are employable. In Estonian startups similarly have created a coding school, which also is in a way outside of the formal education system. It doesn't require any degree for entry. It doesn't give you any kind of recognized diploma, but people are very well employable by the sector. And I'm sure these kind of things are mushrooming globally. It's best if they are done by consortia of business, not kind of one business academy. This way, I mean, I think they develop broader and have more viability.
I'd like to talk a little bit about intellectual property theft, often hacked from businesses like yours, and many, many others, I might say, which allows some of our strategic competitors to leap ahead of where we are. In fact, just last night, I saw that the US government had just put out an advisory that they'd seen new evidence of Russian state actors trying to infiltrate defense contractors in the US to exfiltrate information that might be useful to them. So my question for the three of you is, this has been going on for decades. Industry at this point should have the walls up and be ready to protect itself. It's still happening. How do we protect ourselves? Where can innovation play a part in stopping this? Anybody want to take a stab?
I can try to do a start. For sure, it's a problem. Data leakage is a problem. Luckily, we operate not so much in a consumer space where we have loads of passwords, for instance. But of course, data leakage is a problem, in particular also access to confidential data. Finding out what happened is not easy. But we actually are quite we progressed quite a bit in recent years. Also because we go together into this kind of problem not alone, but in a community. So there is, for instance, what is called the Charter of Trust, where multiple companies come together to discuss exactly these kind of common issues. So how can we make it better? How can we make companies more secure on that point, for instance? And there are some principles everybody signed and agreed to advance on these, taking ownership within a company, for instance, one, or security by design is another one, that you have not something configured like loosely, but it's always tight when you ship it, or looking at the the issues in supply chains that you have. So that's, I think, the way that not companies like alone stand in this fight, but they get together and try to address with the right kind of innovation that is available.
I'd like to share a story. A few years ago, I was in an office in Moscow with the head of Sberbank, Hermann Greff. And there were only a couple of us in that meeting. And at some stage, Greff gets up, takes a phone call. And when he came back, I said, "What was this about?" And he said, "Well, we had an attack." And I think, I know, attacks come from Russia or they come from China. I'm in Russia, so I blurted out, "Oh, that must have come from China." And he took a deep breath and said, "Why don't you think again?" So we have a perspective here, which is really the perspective we grew up with, that cyber attacks come from certain countries. Other countries have a different perspective. Having lived in Shanghai for a few years, I think I can say that.
Well, it's partly still linked also to the problem that if you are able to attribute, attributing is a costly business. If you're able to attribute, you have nowhere to go and complain in this world, and I mean seek some kind of relief. The other issue is that security by design, doesn't involve human beings, and people are people. So normally, why there is, a hole in the system is still a person. But of course, people also can be bought and so on, so on. Fact that we discover these kind of crimes is of course a sign that they are still happening, but also the sign that we are, finding out street crime also still happens, but we are pretty confident that, we are able to follow what is going on and fight back on it. It doesn't mean it will never again happen. It will, but we are able to. So I don't see so big difference in cyberspace and on street space.
This is something that I didn't discuss with any of you ahead of time, but something that I read about all the time, and that's the metaverse, which is the thing of the moment. I saw several eye rolls there when that came up. Why did your eyes roll on that?
Because it's the kind of
talk about it from a security perspective and an innovation perspective, if you would.
So there's a lot of hype around this term now, not actually before Facebook just renamed itself. And it is being discussed in all kinds of companies. Even on our side, it's an interesting thing to project into the future and think, okay, what is the industrial metaverse? What would it be? Is it like a digital factory where we walk around with goggles? Sorry.
Freudian slip.
Yeah, I know. So what is it exactly? And what is this economy that would exist? Because a metaverse without an economy is just VR, AR. So there is some sort of economy inside. And what is it that makes it industrial? I think we don't have the answer. I would be curious to know if somebody else has the answer for this one, but it's definitely an interesting topic.
I think when we talk about metaverse, we need to clearly distinguish two things. One is the Facebook, the feed, and I think that is pretty much dead. So when you look at user numbers, I think we are done with watching Facebook. But on the other hand, Messenger as infrastructure, just like China, WeChat as infrastructure is more important than it's ever been. So I think when we say metaverse, we should be specific about what it is that we're talking about. And I think one of them is dead, the other one is alive, because we always need infrastructure.
Well, I think metaverse is a fantastic idea to take attention away from the fact that we still have the good old problem that anonymous people create bubbles in the internet, making people believe, weird things and breaking our societies. But on the other hand, is our global digital services market so much different from a metaverse? Not this one, but if I want, for example, somebody to design or redesign my office, I will send the 3D, kind of images of it. Somebody somewhere in, I don't know, Australia will help me need to change it. I mean, they'll ask me to walk through this kind of virtual new space, see if it works, I mean, with my needs and so on, so on. So, I mean, basically, all of our lives can, I mean, easily and effectively nowadays be copied in this other world. And what I really enjoy is that this kind of goods services market is globally open, because we have not yet managed to, I mean, break it into protectionist regions and areas. I hope we keep it this way. So there are various takes about this kind of application of our analog world in the digital.
Let me just throw one thing into the mix. I recently talked to researchers in the counterterrorism space who are worried that people can be recruited and organized through the metaverse because those people who you're interacting with look so real, and they can be customized to each individual who's interacting with the metaverse. But we're almost out of time, and I want to ask each of you what you think is the greatest barrier to innovation, and how do we knock it down? You want to start?
The greatest barrier, I think probably people still don't talk enough, like the research community. I mean, there's a lot going on, but there's always an element of I have to invent it on my side, and then I share it with other people. Maybe it's this one. I don't know for sure, but I think it's really important to be open, talk about research, what's going on, and share with other people to advance it.
I like this answer, because this means we will more have kind of open spaces of innovation where people try less to protect but what they have already created in exchange of getting from the other people really good ideas to continue development.
And I have a very different answer. For me, the biggest barrier of innovation is the lack of curiosity. So, or flipping it around, I think the most important gift we can have, or we can give to our students, is to be curious.
And we will leave it there. My thank you to Andreas Weigand, also President Kielulide. Am I saying it correct yet? I'm probably not. You have to excuse me. I lament my lack of language skills. And Andreas Kind. Thank you all for joining us here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're going to switch gears now and talk about military intervention. And joining us now is Rich Lesser. He is the global chair at the Boston Consulting Group. They have done a survey which is of great interest. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this evening and to discuss the important topic of innovation on the eve of the 58th Munich Security Conference. You may be wondering why the global chair of BCG is talking to you about innovation from ministries of defense, but actually BCG has extensive experience in investigating and improving innovation across all sectors. For over 15 years, BCG's conducted an annual study of the most innovative companies around the globe, distilling common trends in innovation and providing recommended actions companies can take to improve their innovation readiness. Additionally, over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, I've heard again and again from leaders around the world that as the world continues to rapidly change, innovation, the ability to continuously learn and to adapt, is more important to them than ever. The latest Most Innovative Companies survey supports this sentiment, with 75% of companies reporting innovation as a top 3 priority for 2021. The imperative to act is urgent. Being an innovation leader is both more important and more accessible than ever. It's no longer about simply spending a large sum of money. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Instead, it's about improving all dimensions of innovation, which by extension has a positive ripple effect throughout the entire organization. We've seen this ripple effect across private and public organizations. For instance, highly innovative companies have outperformed their peers both before and during the COVID-19 economic downturn. All organizations must continue to innovate to either maintain or regain a competitive advantage. Efforts to improve innovation should encompass all areas, including tackling climate change, as these areas are increasingly pointed to by key leaders as critical for innovation efforts. These innovation trends do not exist solely in the private sector. As I'm sure many of you will have experienced yourselves, our learnings from the most innovative companies and other private sector organizations can provide insight to enhance and improve innovation in public sector organizations. I'm excited to bring our innovation work to our partnership with the Munich Security Conference and their Security Innovation Board. I'd like to share with you here some of the key learnings from our first joint study published today entitled Closing the Innovation Readiness Gap. In the fall of 2021, BCG and MSC conducted a joint review of Defense Ministry's innovation activities to better understand the issues inhibiting defense innovation today. This review was enabled by the first annual survey of defense ministries sent to both innovation leaders and to end users within 59 ministries of defense, the European Union and NATO. These survey questions yielded scores that allowed for the comparison of innovation readiness of MODs to their private sector counterparts across 11 core dimensions of innovation. We complemented the survey with additional research on defense ministries in interviews of key global public and private national security leaders. Through this study, we found that MODs face an innovation readiness gap. For all 11 dimensions, MODs fall below the top quartile of private sector organizations. For 7 of the dimensions, MODs fall below the average of private sector organizations, with the most significant gaps in talent and culture, portfolio, and performance management. While MODs may not be surprised to learn that they fall below private sector benchmarks, they can now utilize this set of specific and comparable insights to take action. What then must be done to close this readiness gap? Based on BCG's prior research on highly innovative organizations, the BCG MSC team synthesized the most impactful results of our research into 5 overarching actions that each ministry can take to deliver immediate, consequential reduction of their defense innovation readiness gap. The first action is to define your unique role in the global innovation landscape. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to innovation. For example, South Korea's deep focus on end users' needs required a different approach to innovation than other countries. Each country must select a model that aligns with their needs and with their relative advantages. The second action is to communicate a clear innovation ambition and align incentives. Retaining and attracting top talent requires a clear mandate, a common purpose, and reinforcing incentives. When NATO created a young professional program, it emphasized a sense of purpose and flexible rotation opportunities. The result was 12,000 applications for 20 spots. This is one example where a clear purpose and reinforcing incentives can attract and retain top talent. The third action is to actively manage your innovation portfolio. Shift from a reported focus on individual project silos to a balanced, holistic, and robust project pipeline. Canada's Strategic Innovation Fund systematically incorporates end-user feedback into their regular portfolio reviews. This helps ensure a robust pipeline that is directly aligned with Canada's users' needs. The fourth action is to prioritize and develop meaningful partnerships. Shift focus from adding new partners to also increasing the value of existing partnerships. Mexico has developed a few long-standing bilateral partnerships that have led to over $2 billion in equipment and technical assistance. By prioritizing deep partnerships, Mexico is able to drive outsized investment returns. And the fifth and final action is to deliberately shape the defense innovation market. Influence investments through market signaling, aggregating demand, and other techniques. The French Defense Innovation Agency, AID, hosts exhibits where startups present new technologies to both the French military and to private industry. In 2018 alone, private investors were able to directly observe French military's enthusiasm on more than 160 techniques. The report provides further insight on how ministries can tailor these recommendations to their country-specific context, because we recognize, again, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. My colleague, Matt Schluter, BCG's Global Defense and Security Lead, will share more about the report during the panel coming up shortly. So in conclusion, the imperative to act to close the innovation readiness gap is high. The 5 actions laid out in this report leverage best practices from the private sector and to the parallels between the private and public sector to provide a path for all MODs to increase their innovation readiness and to close the gap. Thank you.
Rich Lesser, thank you so much. We appreciate that. We'll be talking a lot more about this report, what it means, and talking to people in militaries around the world for their reactions to these findings and how they might implement them. And now, it is my extraordinary pleasure to introduce a guest of honor we are thrilled to have with us here tonight. Christine Lambrecht is here with us tonight. She is Germany's Minister of Defense. And it is a wonderful thing to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Look forward to your remarks.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, you are all experts for the new and the unknown. And that is why you are probably very familiar with the following words. It's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. Experts disagree on who said these words. They have been attributed to Mark Twain, Niels Bohr, Winston Churchill, or Karl Valentin, a true Munich original. But no matter who said these mocking words, it has only become so well known because it brings up a painful subject. These words mock the futility of complex human predictions. And by this, these words point out a dilemma of our modern society. We are living in times during which technological progress keeps accelerating. On the one hand, this means if we don't want to be driven by progress, but if we want to shape and control it, we have to plan more and more in advance. On the other hand, this becomes more and more difficult in the face of accelerating dynamics. That is why it is no coincidence that our statements on the future often are quite abstract. It is true that we use flowery language to describe the disruptions that we are confronted with, the challenges that come with them, and the opportunities that we seize and the risks that we want to rein in. But how we will actually do this necessarily remains indefinite and vague. And this applies to politics as well as to all other societal areas. And within politics, it applies to almost all policy areas, including security and defense policy. We know we are living in a time of global power shifts, of new threats and technological quantum leaps. The digital age comes with great disruption, which affects all levels of our security architecture. We know new technologies can strengthen our societies, but they can also make them more vulnerable. The Internet of Everything leads to us being able to control almost everything online, and by that makes us so much faster and more efficient. At the same time, attacks can shut down power plants already today and also threaten us at an individual level, for example with data theft. We know in our highly interconnected society, more and more people have more and more access to the knowledge that is available, and that makes our society more democratic. At the same time, hatred, hate speech, and targeted misinformation can spread as fast as never before, and that makes us vulnerable for information warfare that threaten our democracy. We know new technological possibilities make sure that our forces are networked among themselves, but also with our partners and allies. By ad hoc available joint situational assessments, we can respond much faster to a threat. At the same time, these interfaces give new possibilities of attack to our enemies. The conflicts of the future will not only take place on the ground, at sea, or in the air, but also in the cyberspace and in outer space. We will be confronted with quickly evolving weapons systems. Hypersonic cruise missiles were a thing of the future only a couple of years ago. Today they are a reality. Autonomous weapons systems could replace human beings by and by. Drones as small as a mosquito controlled by artificial intelligence. And already today, the borders between human beings and weapons are blurring. Russia, for example, has developed an exoskeleton that makes soldiers more mobile, more efficient and more able. And in China, bionic research has become a military priority. We all are aware of this, and we are also aware that we have to make our societies more resilient against attacks of any kind, and that we need to make our armed forces fit for new forms of conflicts, for conflict areas and the weapons of the future. And we are working unwaveringly on a digital cultural change of our armed forces. But the further we look ahead, the more vague our statements get, and the less are we able to identify the concrete measures that we will take, because we don't know all the threats that we will be confronted with in the high-tech world, and nobody knows today which digital technologies will dominate the world in a couple of years and what they will mean for our security. But does that mean that we are helpless when it comes to the future? To pick up on the theme of this year's Munich Security Conference, does that mean that our policies are no longer able to shape and control progress? My answer is a clear no. Even though we don't know today which steps we will have to take tomorrow, we can lay the groundwork for the right steps already today by creating the basic conditions that enable us to keep pace with the developments of the future. I would like to stress 4 aspects here. Firstly, we have to invest in the security of tomorrow already today, and I do mean this literally. In order to be able to modernize our armed forces, we will have to take the right financial decisions, and that means that we have to further increase defense spending in a sustainable way. Secondly, we have to shape our processes and procedures in a way that allows us to remain firmly in control, even though developments are accelerating. Talking about the modernization of our federal armed forces, procurement is key. The high speed of innovation sometimes threatens to overtake carefully planned procurement processes, and that is why we have to become faster and more efficient, and we have to make sure that we can readjust and further invest any time. In this sense, I will thoroughly modernize the procurement management of the federal armed forces. Thirdly, progress means responsibility. It is our task to shape progress in a way so that it is in line with ethical principles. That is why this federal government is committed to making the technological weapons developments subject to global arms control, and this particularly applies to biotech, hypersonics, outer space, cyber, and AI. And fourthly, and this is key tonight, progress needs innovation. That is why we want to create infrastructures that promote innovation in the area of security, and we make sure that our armed forces can profit from the rich societal knowledge in innovation. But how can we create helpful and applicable innovation if it is not clear which trend will assert itself and which threat will become real? This is only possible by a culture of experimenting and tinkering, a culture that makes it possible to pursue unconventional ideas too, and a culture where it is okay when such an idea fails, a culture that does not focus on a specific result from the beginning, but on a creative process that can also give rise to something unexpected, and a culture that does not only focus on revolutionary major developments, but that is also able to identify innovation in small projects. The Cyber Innovation Hub of the Federal Armed Forces stands for this very culture, our unit for digital innovation and our interface with the innovation-driving startup ecosystem. Armed forces all around the globe have established such units, and also within NATO we are establishing such a unit, Diana. We know these units rely on you, the smart and creative players of our digital society. The future is everything that you have on your smart boards every day, taken together. I'm talking about the experiments and tinkering, try and error, small and big projects that you are working on. And I'm talking about the innovation that might be the next big thing tomorrow, even if we are not aware of it today. And I'm talking about the innovation that our soldiers benefit from already today. A great example of that is a new mobile light mat. Think of medical services on the ground. A soldier who got shot. The bleeding has to be quenched immediately, but this is only possible if there is sufficient light. Until now, headlamps were used in such situations, but they only shine in the direction in which the person who is wearing it is looking. That is not ideal. But now we have a much more better solution. An extremely light map which lends itself to crumpling, bending and rolling. It fits into every pocket and exudes light constantly. Light intensity and color can be adjusted digitally to the environment. This is a masterwork from the Innovation Hub of the Federal Armed Forces. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, Karl Valentin and others were right. It is difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. However, we don't have to be bothered by that as long as we are well enough prepared for the unpredictable future. This includes a stable financial foundation, good procedures and ethical responsibility, as well as the virtues that the Cyber Innovation Hub stands for: risk, preparedness, appetite for experiments and openness to change. And, of course, people who have appetite for experiments like you. I wish you informative talks with great ideas which will lead to great projects that can then be implemented. And I wish you an interesting Cyber Innovation Night. Thank you.
Ministerin.
Thank you, Madam Minister. We'll have a brief Q&A and pick up on some of the topics that you mentioned, because you did say some quite inspiring things just now. Let's start with the role played by Germany in the digital security architecture of Europe and the rest of the world, if you want. We will look at the digital security architecture that's much discussed. There's a lot of talk about it. What is Germany's role there, and how do we play that out in Europe? Well, our role has to be a very important one. It can be that because we have great conditions. For example, there are many enterprises who are working and playing around with solutions, thinking about how can we implement security. And those questions are very diverse. So we have many creative minds, and I think we have an approach in Germany of dealing with data that has brings together many different aspects. Maybe we're not the ones who are very liberal with their data, and quite rightly so. But I think we have good ideas of how to shape things. And I think that's our task, that we can and must make the most of. That's really important, because we experience today that when we talk about security, we're not really talking much about the conventional attacks on security anymore. Of course, in NATO, in the EU, we're also thinking about attacks that are of a very different nature and therefore also require different solutions. So when there are, for example, if there's targeted disinformation campaigns, how can I counter that? What can I do about that? So if attacks are no longer taking place with conventional weapons, but are taking place by, for example, attacking critical infrastructure, manipulating that, destabilizing that. So those are the challenges, and that's where we need to play an important role. Yes, you just mentioned it, the non-conventional things like cyber security, innovations. Of course, that's also important in the exchange with partners and in working together with the European countries. How would you describe the development of the recent years? There's a lot of exchange and progress. Yes, indeed, there is a lot of exchange with our European partners especially, and that is critical. But on the other hand, our task is also to ensure data security and to bring that into good balance. That's a big challenge. But it can be done by, for example, developing clear rules for the joint use of data. I just described it. Between different units, or armed forces, or between different countries, it's important to have trust and to use data according to clear rules. And the data is very valuable, but of course they need to be appropriately protected so that there can be no access from unauthorized sites. That's a big challenge for the future. Well, you mentioned a couple of examples, and there are challenges if we look at the overall topic issue. So there are many things, short-term, long-term challenges for us and for NATO. Have you got some concrete examples that can maybe support that there's a common vision, that the innovation strategy is being adapted and there's courage? Well, I think it's the opportunities. That's what connects us. We are in a world where there's a lot of change in the digital world. To deny that makes no sense. It's as if you were trying to stop the clock. That doesn't work. So it only works if we all are open to it, but on a clear basis with clear rules, especially also with ethical rules. They need to be the foundation for making sure that you can rely on AI, on the services of AI, and know what it's being used for and what not. So you need clear rules of the game. So that's necessary to achieve acceptance. And I think we are engaged in a good exchange, and that makes sense too, because then we can get better together. So the exchange is really paramount, because if everyone only works in their particular area, maybe you make tiny baby steps forward, but the network and connecting with each other, learning from each other, that brings us ahead. And maybe that allows us then to control or manage developments that we knew nothing of a few years back. You just mentioned the opportunities. So let me come back to young talents, creative and agile minds that can work in an existing system to change something, to maybe be an added value to these digital innovation units. Apparently, the people who work there are impressed and enjoy it, but how can you bring other people there? Well, I mentioned one example with this light map. It's great how you can simplify work on operations with such an innovation. And that's exactly what we need in the small, but also in the bigger realm. And it's important that we have talents who are open to approach such processes, maybe not with the intention to develop such a light mat, but to just be curious and look, what can we do in this area? How can we go about it? So offering a platform where you can go wild and where you can try and fail, I think that's something that we need to provide, that there's not immediately an expectation of success, but saying, yes, play around. If there's an outcome, great. But if not, I'm sure it will bring us ahead. And it's important that people realize, yes, that's a great employer where I can do something that I enjoy. And it's important to support that. Okay. Unlearning helplessness. That's the motto of this year's Munich Security Conference. You said there's still a lot that remains to do. And there is a lot to do for those who want an exchange. What would you expect from those who are present here? Well, today it's a great platform. People get together from many different areas and exchange. But that's one night, Cyber Innovation Night. And I think we need to have more opportunities like that. So getting people from business, from civil society, private individuals who have a good idea or who want to play a part, getting that together with administration and with politics. Think across borders and work across borders too. In politics, we sometimes think in our own ministry. So I'm responsible for defense and the Ministry of the Interior is responsible for safe infrastructure. But these things concern us all because, as I said, everybody can benefit if creative minds get together and work together to develop something, maybe have a completely different perspective on the ones that we in our ministries deal with. That is an opportunity and that is something we can support. And we have to do that because otherwise we will lose the good talents. They may leave the country or put their talents elsewhere, and doing that, I think, is really important. Yes, so that was an invitation, and the exchange can start now, I think. I'd like to hand over to you, Jean, now. Thank you.
Dear Hanne-Klaus, thank you for doing the duties in German, which I clearly could not handle. Thank you so much. We heard from Rich Lesser earlier that there is indeed a readiness gap and that militaries lag behind the private sector when it comes to innovation. We're going to talk for the rest of the evening about how to address that, how to erase that. So first, let me introduce Margarita Schines, Vice President for Promoting the European Way of Life with the European Commission. Over to you.
Thank you, Jane. I'm very pleased to take part in this session of the Innovation Night. This discussion could not be more timely. Tensions at our eastern external borders remind us once again that those who want to harm our societies and democracies no longer limit their pervasive actions to traditional areas of confrontation. They are using cyberspace and the fields of information and perception as their playground. They even weaponize human lives for political purposes. As a result of this hybridization of security threats, the front lines are becoming increasingly blurred. If we want to be ready to defend ourselves and respond to these constantly evolving threats, if we want to be able to protect our union and our citizens, we need innovation. We need innovation not only in our systems, but also in our approach to modern threats. And for that, we need to use the full potential and expertise of our 27 member states, build synergies across the board, and remove self-imposed barriers between civilian and defense research. 2 days ago, in Strasbourg, the European Commission presented a defense package, a set of proposals that aims precisely to develop state-of-the-art, made in Europe defense capabilities. With this package, our aim is threefold. First, to promote an EU-wide strategic and coordinated approach to defense innovation and to develop joint procurement on defense capabilities. There are two main reasons for this. First, we can only have a robust European defense if European national armed forces speak the same language and use interoperable equipment. And two, we need to step up the competitiveness of our EU defense technological and industrial base. With the considerable resources for the next 7 years of the European Defence Fund, we will be co-funding, together with our member states, joint, disruptive, high-risk defense innovation projects. And I'm confident that this will help develop European breakthrough technologies. But we also need to further stimulate investment in strategic capabilities and in critical enablers, especially where we already have EU cooperative frameworks. And we will explore a number of financial incentives in that regard. Second priority, to boost innovation in critical technologies. This is the main objective of the roadmap on critical technologies for security and defense that we presented this week. Working with member states' governments, we will prepare technology roadmaps to boost research and innovation. We will set up a number of tools to support innovation and entrepreneurship, and notably a defense innovation scheme and a new innovation incubator on new technologies and dual-use innovation. In Europe, our aim is to tap into the enormous potential for synergies in innovation between civilian and defense research. There are countless examples of how disruptive technological innovations in the defense sector have had a spillover effect on innovation in technologies for civilian use. And wherever possible, our defense industry should be able to draw on EU civilian research achievements to avoid costly duplicated research. A concrete example is the proposal for a secure space-based connectivity system that we just presented, where an important innovation is the dual use by design element, as the system will have both civilian and defense application. And finally, let me come with an area that will benefit for sure from the cross-fertilization, and this is cyber. Whether in conventional warfare or in the case of hybrid threats, you will be first hit in any case in your cyberspace. Just look at what happens in Ukraine. The Ministry of Defense, the Armed Forces, the Ministry of Education and Science, banks, all of them were hit by cyber attacks in the recent days. So we have always been at the forefront of developing these innovative cybersecurity solutions. We have tried to build common knowledge, joining forces from all across Europe, and we are doing now is to bring all this knowledge into the defense sector, to foster synergies between cybersecurity and cyber defense, explore potential dual-use applications, and make the most of disruptive innovation for our defense in the cyberspace. All this will overall contribute to the third priority, that is to better protect contested areas, be it cyber, space, or hybrid. In all, we need a European approach covering both operational and regulatory needs. This will not only reinforce common EU approaches, but will also render the EU stronger as a like-minded partner against common threats. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, and we're now going to dig even deeper. Joining me now is Mircea Joanna. He's Deputy Secretary General of NATO. It's an honor to have you here. And also Matt Schluter, who is the Managing Director and Partner with the Boston Consulting Group. Great to have you both with us here today. Deputy Secretary General, let me start with you. We've heard a lot about the innovation landscape writ large. How do you perceive NATO's role within this landscape?
You know, historically, the ones who are leading and winning the technological race are having strategic superiority. It's a fact of life. So NATO, the most important alliance in history, we have in our DNA permanent adaptation and transformation. That's what we do as we speak. I chair the innovation board in NATO. I also chair the cyber adaptation effort in NATO. I also do, speaking of Minister Lambrecht, she was great, by the way, at her first defense ministerial. I come straight from the airport, from Brussels. So it's very, very important for us, all of us in the Euro-Atlantic area, is to foster the talent we have, the fact that we still have technological edge. This is contested for the first time probably in centuries. And this is why NATO is the indispensable platform to harness innovation and technologies for defense and security.
Matt, what more should NATO be thinking about?
So thanks, Jean. So a couple things as we think about NATO specifically and more broadly. I think in the research we did, we spoke with 59 different ministries of defense as well as the EU and NATO. So this is very broad and across. But one thing I'd offer on the point of talent is what we saw is there's a lot of ministries that have an ambition, that have a public ambition, but what we saw is that the context for their people to actually action that ambition hasn't changed. What I mean by that is the rewards and the incentives that are in place need to be adjusted so that people are rewarded for taking some of the initiatives we talked about tonight. And the issue we found is many of them, I could talk to some of the numbers, 59% of people, the respondents on their innovation team felt that it wasn't an attractive destination for the best talent. 64% of people on average, across all the MODs we looked at, they felt that, go ahead.
Can I ask why?
Yeah, so it's all that context. It's the context around, are they getting incentivized? Are they rewarded for pursuing some of the ambition? And I'll give one example. When you look at the portfolio of initiatives that are done, many people tend to bias towards near-term initiatives because that's what they're rewarded for. They're rewarded for more risk-averse initiatives. That's what the data showed us in the research. So as we talk about both NATO and all the ministries of defense, it's about changing some of the reward structure to incentivize people to take on some of those more bigger initiatives that they can.
NATO has been trying to address the talent issue. Tell us about your success or challenges.
We do, and the beauty of this great alliance, that we have 30 allies, 1 billion people, more than 50-something% of global GDP is in NATO countries. And I read and I contributed to the BSG report. I was interviewed, and I salute the fact that MSC and BSG are doing this. And we also struggle with these issues in governments. But the usefulness of NATO is the fact that we can match very important allies, US and Germany and many others that have very deep venture capital markets, very endowed universities. They attract talent also from worldwide with the smaller allies. Because the fact that NATO is addressing new technologies like AI and data exploitation, quantum, biotechnology, space, unmanned vehicles, of course, supersonic, hypersonic missiles, is in fact, the business of NATO is to keep all allies, what we call in our jargon, interoperable. So, meaning they should be able to exercise together, to train together, and God forbid, even fight together. For this means that one size fits all doesn't work. I agree with the BSG report. But NATO is that irrespective of the 30 nations with different sizes, the output of NATO is a homogeneous alliance, of course, able to use technologies in a way that will make all our militaries. Look at the new technology of space. Look at cyber. Look at resilience. Look at AI. This will mean that we have to be able to do things together. Speaking of talent, of course that is the financial reward is important for everyone.
And you're competing against private industry.
Yes, but let me tell you something. Let me tell you something, Jean, something very interesting. We organized in NATO a competition for 12 jobs as young professionals. You know how many applications we got for 12 jobs in NATO? 14,000 applications to join our work. Why? Because these youngsters, when they hear about NATO, they feel that there is something more than just a job. There's something more than just having some KPIs and some return on investment. They feel that they are doing something important to keep 1 billion people safe and keep the world safe. So that's a strong incentive for what we do after we get the talent, how we retain them, how to continue to motivate them. That's a different story. But NATO is a very attractive brand. And this is also our job, Secretary General's, my job, is to make sure that we also communicate. And so that's what we are trying to do.
So with all those applicants, did you really only hire 12 of them? There must have been scores.
But others will probably continue to apply for jobs. We'll do something quite interesting with them, just to keep them motivated and also to put the seed of the future leaders of this alliance. Because now they're very young. In a few years' time flies fast, they will come to be in my position. So what we offer for them, 3 years, and every 6 months they rotate in a different part of the NATO ecosystem. In headquarters in Brussels, then they go to SHAPE, then they go to Norfolk, then they go to NCIA, to our agencies. So after 3 years, this wonderful group and others like them will be understanding what NATO represents and will be able to do whatever job they will be assigned to be doing. And also something that we also do in NATO differently. we have roughly 50% of our staff is permanent staff. The rest are rotating. So we are also very proud when people come and serve in NATO, work for us, and then after a few years they leave for something else. Better, smarter, better leaders, and also understanding the importance of NATO and of our alliance.
I'm curious if, in addition to having people rotate within NATO, you also have people who go into private industry for a stretch, planned, and then come back to you. And so there's cross-fertilization.
This is sort of a European jargon. It's called passerelle. So basically a two-way street between private sector and NATO. We have also, speaking of cyber, of course we say nice words about ourselves, but we don't have enough talent to cover the immense needs. So sometimes we hire consultants, sometimes nations send what they call secondments to us. We even have people seconded to us from Australia. I work in my team with a bright young woman from Finland. They're not a member, but they are part of what we do together. And by the way, we had today at the NATO Defense Ministerial, we had a session with Georgia and Ukraine, very important. But in the afternoon, we had something with Sweden, Finland, and Josep Borrell from the European Union. So that's probably NATO is a bit more flexible. It doesn't appear like this because we also have our military component. But NATO is a quite interesting organization, and that's why I think we have a better chance to attract and retain talent.
I think that's great. There's one point I'd pick up on based on your comments from what the DSG said. It's you talked about the homogenization kind of across NATO and helping people work together. One thing I commend NATO for, and I think this is something that the data would say needs to be replicated across more partnerships, is the governance around some of the partnerships. So what we found, which was actually quite surprising in a lot of the data, is that there's no lack of partnerships. Many people say we need more partnerships. There's actually a lot of partnerships out there. But what's missing is actually the governance around those partnerships. So what we found is, especially on investments, and especially on syndicating information and communicating, that's not done nearly as well as it needs to be. I know that's one in some of our discussions. That's one thing NATO is doing quite well from our view in terms of the ability to syndicate that information and the ability to do things around investing that other partnerships need to replicate.
There is something else that NATO is very useful to our allies. Of course, allies have the national defense forces. They have what it takes. We are just in case in need, we take over and we do our job. So what's interesting and beautiful and interesting about NATO and useful to nations is that we in a way, we congregate the multiple national experiences of allies. So I call and I invite DARPA to speak to us. You know that DARPA, the famous agency, they have only 200 people. That's all they've had. They have a budget, but nobody is basically hired other than on the length, the duration of one project. Then they leave. Then I go to the Czech Republic, and then I go to Montenegro. Then I go to beautiful Estonia. Then I go to my home country, Romania. And everybody is supposed to have defense planning, including spending money, a lot or little money, according to the GDP, on things that make sense for defense planning together in NATO. So NATO is a force of federation of ideas. Sometimes things that do not work are also shared amongst allies. Listen, I tried that, it failed. This is good for the other allies not to make the same error, because sometimes it's trial and error that is the mother of progress.
Do member countries always want to share, or do they have a proprietary interest in holding their intellectual property close?
Of course, it's normal. Every national government has a natural tendency and an obligation to protect the industry, to make sure the intellectual property is used to the benefit of the citizens and the taxpayers. That's absolutely normal. That's what politicians do. But again, when it comes to NATO, the business of NATO is to keep all of us safe. So this is priceless, and this is where nations share in NATO more eagerly than in a normal multinational, international organization, because this is about our security, our safety, and the future of our kids. So I would say that NATO, not everybody is sharing everything, let's not go there, but they share far more. And there is an intimacy amongst us and a level of trust amongst us. And also, we are an organization that is not leaking information to our adversaries. So people trust that when there is something that comes to NATO, that information is safe. That technology is in good hands. And that's why NATO is probably a place where nations share more than in normal situations.
Matt, in your study, did you find that there were shortcomings in the way that some militaries kept track of their innovation and measured their progress?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, that was the impetus for the whole study. I mean, what we heard in many of the interviews that we did is there's a number of great activities happening. We heard everything from, hiring, reorganizations and hiring new chief innovation officers and Silicon Valley tours, and that's all great. But to actually systematically quantify and measure your ability to innovate, that's the critical piece of insight that was missing. And that's what was helpful when we brought in the commercial perspective that Rich alluded to earlier in terms of the thousands of interviews we've done in the last 15 years of surveying innovators on the commercial side. We were able to use that framework and had a holistic framework across 11 dimensions that helped to quantify. And the feedback we've gotten initially is it's done three things. One is it's been more precise than people have seen previously, which is helpful. Secondly, it's helpful to see comparatively how you actually compare with the private sector. But I think most importantly, the feedback we've got is the third element, which is it provides a heat map for ministries to be able to look and say, hey, where do I need to improve? And when I make an investment, is it paying off? So that's what we provide with this report. I think it's filling a gap that, at least from the information we heard, it was actually missing in many different ministries.
No, that's a very useful exercise, because sometimes people from the outside, they have sometimes, if you want, a more distanced, but also in a way more lucid view of things. Let me say one thing. Every year, Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, as an obligation, publishes the report on what we call burden sharing. And it's interesting to see that after the occupation of Crimea illegally by Russia in 2014, defense spending in NATO was going down, abruptly down. That was a wake-up call. And in the last 7-8 years from 2014, allied nations together spend more than $217 billion extra. In a way, it's the opposite of what Mr. Putin had the intention to.
Of course, you also had President Trump chastising
all American presidents had made the point, and I think this is a correct point to make. So even if not all allies have reached the 2% threshold, 24 of the 30 allies have reached the other sub-indicator, which is to spend more than 20% on new equipments and on R&D. This means that slowly and relatively interestingly, the way in which national MODs and national establishments are spending the money is becoming more and more towards new technologies, and this is in a way creating critical mass also for the industry. And something I would like to say, and this is something that we are trying to do. Sometimes now 90% of innovation that is used for defense and security is produced by the private sector. It's the opposite of the 70s. So it's also our interest, and that's what I'm doing. I'm on a roadshow almost every day in talking to industry, and not only to usual defense industry, but also to technology, to startups, to venture capital, and to tell them how do we anticipate the utility and also the risk of new technologies. And the moment they hear from us, they can be, also private sector, can be even more useful to defense needs of allied nations.
Yeah, Matt, what did you find?
Really interesting point that the DSU mentions, and what I'd highlight is when you talk about the pivot that happened, when governments used to provide more of the innovation, now it's the private sector, there's an implication of that we've seen. And what we saw in the data is it drives more of a near-term bias in the types of innovations that are purchased. And it's taken the role of government findings. What we had is that ministries have a unique position to play a much greater role in the defense marketplace than they have previously. So what does that mean? It means things like setting standards for open systems, which is something only a ministry could do on behalf of everyone. It's other things such as, providing the end user feedback and talking about future upgrades earlier in the process. It's things like using the authorities that are available. We heard a whole bunch in the surveys about, we can't innovate fast enough, or industry has a lead. There's actually a lot of authority authorities available, both in, we looked at both NATO and non-NATO countries, but pretty much across the board, the authorities are available to do a lot of what needs to be done for the ministries to better influence that market.
That's why we have, and I think this is the most interesting evolution in NATO. Our leaders at the Brussels summit last June decided for NATO, upon our proposal, to create what they call a Defence Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, DIANA, the acronym. What's this? It's a collection of test centers, of accelerators, of places where all over the alliance research and development is done. And also we are now creating, for the first time, a NATO Innovation Fund. It's not a lot of money, 1 billion or something. You cannot compare with venture capital and financial markets. But this money will be very important because this will be seed money for startups and SMEs and innovators that will have at their disposal, free of charge, the DIANA ecosystem, so the sandboxes, and then if we put a little money on a new, smart, promising technology, it's also a stamp of approval, and then with that product, they can go on the real markets, get the real money, and we'll make sure that also that capital is trusted. And this is something that is a beautiful evolution in NATO as an aggregator and as a common denominator on the high up for all member states, big and small, North American or European, Eastern European, Northern European, Southern European. That's what we are doing things together and harnessing the talent of our innovation ecosystem.
Matt, did you also look at how militaries engage with academia, or was that outside the scope?
We did look at it, and what we found is it's in looking at partnerships in general. We looked at academia, we looked at industry, we looked at accelerators, we looked at hubs and so forth. And so in many ways we looked at all of them together, and that's where the findings came twofold. I touched on earlier that it's not about the volume of partnerships, it's really the value and how you govern those partnerships. But what I would mention is also it's the focus of some of the partnerships. So what we found, and DSG Giwana alluded to it, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We felt that defense ministries really need to look at 5 different business models, and why that's important is their partnering strategy needs to follow suit. What we found is in some of the feedback we got, they said, oh, I need to have a relationship with this university because we heard someone else does, or this university because someone else does. That shouldn't be the driver. The driver should be your respective business model, what you're trying to get out of the innovation ecosystem, what you're trying to contribute based on your comparative advantage, and that should drive your partnering strategy rather than the other way.
We also try to do something, and this report is just great, and we'll make sure we disseminate it across the alliance. Secretary General Stoltenberg basically created an advisory group on innovation for NATO. And of course, I work more closely with this group. That's 10 people, men and women from across the alliance, with superb experience in business, in academia, in AI, in quantum, in physics, in space, everything. And they provide to us, upon a conversation with us, an annual report. This is the second report that they issued today. It's on what? Human capital and how to harness the innovation ecosystem, what they call the triple helix between private sector, public sector, academia, and civil society. So what I'm just trying to say, and if you look to the first annual report of this group, I think that more than 80% of their recommendations are already policy adopted, approved in NATO. So I think that with an organization with our size, and big bureaucracies are sometimes small, I think we're becoming more agile. Also, we're trying to improve procurement, which is an obstacle. We want to make sure that we don't buy equipment for yesterday or for today, but for the day after tomorrow. So I think that NATO is in a process of massive positive transformation. And in Madrid at our next summit, I know that our leaders will give us, also in the strategic concept, a lot of attention to new technologies, to what they call EDTs, and for NATO to keep its technological edge, because in the end, that's military supremacy, and that's the business of NATO.
You mentioned interoperability, and in previous conversations I've had with people from NATO, they've indicated that has been challenging. Do you feel you have conquered the interoperability problem?
This is a struggle that happens every day. We are now 73 years old as an organization, and we are considered to be the most successful alliance in history. Why? Because every single day we struggle to improve. No, it's not perfect. No, it's not perfect. But we are aware of the strong points and also of the weaker points, and we try to address in a lucid way those issues. I know one thing, that interoperability is one of the most, other than values, what is basically binding all of us together? 1 billion people, 30 nations. It's our values, our shared interest to protect our population from any harm, and then to be able to work together and eventually fight together. So for us, it's bread and butter. There's no day, no second that we are not thinking of how we can make our armed forces and our military and also our technological ecosystems work better together. And that's a struggle that we'll continue to do quite aggressively in the years to come.
I would like to ask each of you what you think is the biggest obstacle to more rapid and successful innovation. Matt, why don't I start with you on that one?
So consistently throughout the research we did, whether it was on their overall ability to innovate as an organization, whether it was specific initiatives and looking at the ROI, the lack of measurement and the lack of understanding and ability to quantify is what we thought was one of the biggest impediments. And so when they went to get support, being able to communicate, well, what was the value of what I actually did and demonstrate that? There's a lot of money being spent in a lot of places, but the ROI, the value that was achieved from that, that's what was missing. And so that's one piece that we think as that's further embedded, it will help a lot of the different dimensions. It'll help the talent to see what they're delivering. It'll help to get more funding. It'll help to change the culture and mindset. So that's really one of the fundamental aspects of changing the overall ecosystem and being more helpful for MODs that are participating in it.
Listen, I'm a political guy. So
for better or worse, I might.
No, for better. For better. Because I lived in my many incarnations the struggle of governments and bureaucracies to be up to the job. What I believe is the most important challenge for us, and we are really fighting as much as we can with that one, is the fact that there is a sort of a misconception that innovation is only for innovators, that innovation is for the chief innovation officer, or we hired from private sector, a new CIO for NATO. We are so proud of that. He came from private industry. He never worked one day in his life in a bureaucracy. He came from private sector. We recruited him. Great addition to our team. So what I'd like to say that the most important challenge is to have a culture of innovation across the board. From the small thing that our fantastic photographer here does better to everything we do. So a culture of innovation is a state of mind, and it's a way to run business. It's not just a segment of people that are quite smart, very smart, super smart, and the rest do the regular business of the day. So that's the business I'm doing on behalf of the Secretary General, to instill a culture of innovation on everything we do. And then when I understand what really innovation means, then a certain, slowness that is part of big bureaucracies is replaced by something with agility, ingenuity, and less risk-averse mentalities in some of our institutions. So I think we are on the right track. We have a long, difficult journey ahead of us. And I have to say this is for the first time in many centuries, this is a challenge for technological supremacy that we must win. And we will win that one.
We certainly hope so. Thank you so much, Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Mircea Joanna. Thank you so much for being here. Matt Schluter, Managing Director at Boston Consulting Group. Really appreciated the report and your insights into the report, and best of luck going forward. And I am now going to turn things over to Michael Vetter. He is head of the Cyber and Information Technology Department and Chief Information Officer at the Federal Ministry of Defense in Germany. Over to you.
Jean, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are reaching the end of this year's MSC Innovation Night, and before wrapping up, I would like to take the chance and thank those who have played a crucial role in making this Innovation Night happen, even under the still special circumstances of COVID-19. Thank you to the MSC Foundation and Siemens for continuing a tradition established already in 2018 and again organizing the MSC Innovation Night. Thank you to Boston Consulting Group for their support Thanks to the team of the Bundeswehr Cyber Innovation Hub, first and foremost to Sven Weizenegger, the Hub CIO, and Florian Busch-Janser, who really organized this event. Congratulations for getting so many first-class participants joining us here to discuss innovation on the front lines. Excellent job. In addition, I would like to wholeheartedly thank all the speakers, panelists for joining us tonight and for providing us with their thoughts and consideration. And certainly, thank you, Jean, for your brilliant moderation, very insightful and absolutely sharp. Thank you for joining us and supporting us tonight. 2 years ago, the MSC Innovation Night was held in the Siemens headquarters with more than 800 guests joining us there, and today we had to fall back again on the digital format. However, being able to organize such an event virtually shows the value of innovation and digitization for all parts of society, from the front lines of event management to the front lines protected and defended by our armed forces. To conclude this event, please allow me to focus on 2 key issues: the importance of digitization and innovation from a military perspective and their impact on digital sovereignty. Digitization is a key factor in the Bundeswehr resilience in all critical situations. It will affect, and at least in part disrupt, every aspect of the military, from the manner we handle our administrative workflows, to the way we respond to an ever more complex threat environment, to the means by which we fight on a digitized battlefield. We are literally overwhelmed by what some would call a technological tsunami, of which the most consequential include both biotechnology, quantum nanotechnology, robotics, 5G, beyond 5G. But the most significant is for sure artificial intelligence. AI as a knowledge and reasoning system will affect every other field of emerging technology. It will become a pervasive and therefore decisive technology. And it will compress decision timeframes from minutes to seconds, expand the scales of attacks, and demand responses that will certainly exceed the limits of human cognition. To this end, the opportunities offered by new technologies must be leveraged consistently, but the responsible use of new technologies must always be the guiding principle. With those new technologies emerging, the challenges and risks are equally becoming more complex and multidimensional. And the boundaries between internal and external security, between peace, crisis and war, are increasingly blurred. With regard to cyber, there is sufficient evidence now proving that the cyber and information domain, as we call it in Germany, is increasingly used for offensive and destabilizing activities. And the current events in Ukraine certainly support this observation. The risks for attackers are manageable, as identifying them is difficult. The anonymity have turned cyber attacks and malicious actions in the information environment into a very powerful tool, which is often used to achieve objectives without a need to cross the threshold of a direct military aggression. And in times of liminal warfare, as some call it, the conventional instruments of deterrence face unprecedented challenges, and we have to confront the lurking risk that we will one day wake up being locked into a technological dependency which has the potential to seriously affect our sovereignty and ability to act and to defend our democratic values and freedom. So what can we do? With the increasing relevance of the cyber and information domain, we need to build cyber resilience and complete below the threshold of war to deter war. And this is far more than just a military matter. We need to integrate all levels of power and capabilities within a whole of government or even a whole of society approach to security and defense. And this has to include civil society, academia, and industry, and also tech. We need to build strong and trusting partnerships with allies and like-minded partners. Those are critical to maintain our ability to deter above and below the threshold of conflict. And cyber resilience depends on our ability to preserve the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data and services that are important to fulfill the core mission. In order to meet those challenges, among others, it is crucial to strengthen and guarantee the digital sovereignty of our societies, including defense. And the Federal Ministry of Defense in Germany will do what is necessary to maintain the armed forces' ability to act in the digital environment securely, independently, and without unwanted third-party influence. Digital sovereignty, as we see it, includes 6 fields of action: the use of trustworthy IT, the build-up and maintenance of key technologies in Europe, in Germany, within NATO,
the maintenance of core command and control capabilities, the promotion of digital competencies across the entire personnel, the build-up and maintenance of data sovereignty, and last but definitely not least, to expand our capability to innovate. And this is what this evening was about. So digitalization and disruptive technologies will have tremendous effects on the development of our society, but also on the battlefield of tomorrow. And the cyber and information domain is becoming more and more important, and it needs to be considered there at every step across the whole spectrum of operations. We are laying the foundations today, and it is our aspiration as the Bundeswehr not only to adapt to the rapid developments and requirements of the digital age, rather we want to play an active role in shaping the transformation process and taking advantage of the opportunities offered there. Ladies and gentlemen, to quote the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, we have to win and we will win. With this concludes the MSC 2022 MSC Innovation Night. Thank you for your interest in taking part in our event. We very much look forward to meeting you again, hybrid, in person, virtually, next year. Take care and goodbye.